What happens when the most advanced stealth fighter in the American arsenal locks onto an Iranian drone just miles from US warships in contested waters? This isn't a hypothetical scenario, it's the reality unfolding right now in the Middle East, and it reveals something far more significant than a simple military encounter. This F-35 intercept represents a critical inflection point in a broader power struggle that's been building for decades, one that challenges the very architecture of American naval dominance in a region that's been the linchpin of dollar hegemony since the 1970s. While mainstream media frames this as another routine cat-and-mouse game, the deeper truth is far more unsettling. Iran's drone operations near US carrier groups aren't just about reconnaissance. They're probing for vulnerabilities, testing response times, and gathering intelligence on the electromagnetic signatures of our most sophisticated defense systems. Every intercept, every radar lock, every close encounter feeds data into Tehran's asymmetric warfare doctrine, a strategy designed specifically to neutralize America's overwhelming conventional military superiority. And here's what nobody's telling you. These drones cost a fraction of what we spend on a single F-35 sortie, yet they're forcing us to reveal our capabilities while Iran learns exactly how we respond to threats in their backyard. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're witnessing here, because the conventional analysis you're getting from the talking heads on cable news is missing the forest for the trees. This F-35 intercept of an Iranian drone isn't just another data point in a long list of Middle Eastern tensions. It's a symptom of something much larger, something that goes to the very heart of how power is shifting on the global stage, and more importantly, how the old guard, the established powers who've controlled the chessboard for the better part of a century, are scrambling to maintain their grip even as the board itself is being restructured beneath their feet. Think about this for a moment. We're deploying fifth-generation stealth fighters, aircraft that cost approximately $80 million apiece, with operational costs that run into the tens of thousands per flight hour, to intercept drones that Iran can produce for a few $100,000 at most. On the surface, this seems like a straightforward application of military superiority. We have better technology, so we use it. But dig deeper and you start to see the asymmetry working in exactly the opposite direction than what the Pentagon would have you believe. Iran isn't trying to match our carrier groups ship for ship or our Air Force plane for plane. They learned a long time ago that fighting a conventional war against the United States is a losing proposition. Instead, they've developed what military strategists call an asymmetric doctrine, and it's working precisely because it forces us into a game where our advantages become liabilities. Every time we scramble an F-35 to intercept one of these drones, we're revealing information. We're showing them our response protocols, our reaction times, our radar signatures at various distances and altitudes. We're teaching them exactly how our Aegis combat systems prioritize threats, how our ships maneuver when they detect an incoming contact, how our fighter aircraft coordinate with naval assets. This is intelligence gathering at its finest, and the beautiful part, from Iran's perspective, is that we can't afford not to respond. When a drone approaches a carrier strike group, we have to treat it as a potential threat. We have to intercept it. We have to follow our procedures. And in doing so, we hand over data that Tehran's military planners can analyze, catalog, and incorporate into their operational planning. Now, let's zoom out and look at the broader context, because this confrontation doesn't exist in a vacuum. The United States has maintained a massive military presence in the Middle East for decades, and the official narrative has always been about stability, about keeping the oil flowing, about preventing regional conflicts from spiraling out of control. But the real story, the one that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, is about maintaining the petrodollar system. When Nixon took the United States off the gold standard in 1971, the dollar became a pure fiat currency backed by nothing but faith and credit. The solution to this potential crisis was the petrodollar agreement with Saudi Arabia, struck in 1974. Oil would be priced in dollars, which meant every country on earth needed dollars to buy energy, which meant demand for dollars remained high, which meant the United States could print money to finance its deficits without triggering the hyperinflation you'd normally expect from such policies. This system has been the foundation of American economic hegemony for 50 years. It's what allows us to run trillion-dollar deficits without immediate consequences. It's what gives the Federal Reserve the ability to conduct monetary policy that would destroy any other currency. It's what enables the United States to weaponize the financial system, cutting countries off from dollar-based transactions as a form of economic warfare. And it's this system, more than any other single factor, that Iran threatens simply by existing as an independent power in the world's most strategic energy region. Iran sits on some of the largest oil and natural gas reserves on the planet. They control the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. They have influence over Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and increasingly Afghanistan. They've built relationships with Russia and China that give them protection from the kind of regime change operations that toppled governments in Libya, Iraq, and attempted to topple Syria. In short, Iran represents a node of resistance to the unipolar world order that emerged after the Cold War, and that makes them a problem that the architects of that order have been trying to solve for decades. The sanctions, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the sabotage of nuclear facilities, the targeted killings of scientists, the support for opposition groups, the diplomatic isolation, all of this has been aimed at either forcing Iran back into the fold or creating the conditions for regime change. But here's what's fascinating and what nobody really wants to acknowledge. It hasn't worked. Iran is still standing. Their economy has been battered, absolutely, but they've adapted. They've built domestic industries, developed indigenous military capabilities, strengthened regional alliances, and found ways to sell their oil despite sanctions. They've survived everything we've thrown at them, and in the process, they've become a symbol to other countries that it is possible to resist American pressure and live to tell the tale. This brings us back to these drone encounters, because they're not happening in isolation from this larger strategic competition. When Iran flies drones near American warships, they're sending a message that goes beyond simple military signaling. They're demonstrating that the Persian Gulf is their home territory, not ours. They're showing that they can operate in these waters despite our overwhelming conventional military superiority. They're proving to the region and to the world that the American military presence, while formidable, is not omnipotent and is certainly not unchallenged. And perhaps most importantly, they're collecting the intelligence they would need if this cold confrontation ever turns hot. Let's talk about what a real conflict would look like, because the scenarios are sobering and almost never discussed honestly in American media. A shooting war between the United States and Iran wouldn't be like Iraq in 2003, where we faced a degraded military that had been hollowed out by a decade of sanctions and no-fly zones. Iran has been preparing for this fight for 40 years. They've studied American military doctrine extensively. They know they can't win a conventional engagement, so they won't fight one. Instead, they've developed what they call a mosaic defense, layers of different capabilities that work together to make an attack on Iran extremely costly. They have thousands of missiles of various ranges and capabilities, many of them mobile and hidden in hardened bunkers or mountainous terrain that's nearly impossible to target. They have naval mines that could close the Strait of Hormuz for weeks or months. They have small boat swarms equipped with missiles and torpedoes that could overwhelm the defenses of even our most advanced warships through sheer numbers. They have proxy forces throughout the region who could attack American bases and allies simultaneously, opening up multiple fronts that would stretch our forces thin. They have cyber capabilities that could target critical infrastructure both in the region and potentially in the United States itself. And yes, they have drones, thousands of them of various sizes and capabilities that could be used for reconnaissance, for targeting, or as weapons themselves. The Pentagon's own war games have consistently shown that a conflict with Iran would be extremely costly. We would almost certainly win in the sense that we could destroy Iran's military and potentially its government, but the price would be measured in thousands of American casualties, hundreds of billions or even trillions of dollars in economic costs, a global oil crisis that could trigger a worldwide recession, the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz, attacks on American bases throughout the Middle East, a massive refugee crisis, regional instability that could last for decades, and a dramatic increase in anti-American sentiment that would fuel terrorism and extremism for a generation. This is why, despite all the tough talk and maximum pressure campaigns, no American president has actually pulled the trigger on a full-scale war with Iran. The costs are simply too high and the benefits are unclear at best. But here's where things get really interesting, and this is what you need to understand about the current moment we're living through. The world is changing in fundamental ways that make the old playbook less and less effective. China has become an economic superpower that can offer countries an alternative to the Western-dominated financial system. Russia has rebuilt its military and reasserted itself as a major power, as we've seen dramatically in Ukraine. The BRICS nations are actively working on mechanisms to trade outside the dollar system. Countries around the world are diversifying their reserve holdings away from dollar-denominated assets. The Saudi Arabia that once was absolutely dependent on American military protection is now talking to China about pricing oil in yuan. The entire architecture of American global dominance is being challenged in ways it hasn't been since the Cold War. Iran understands this context perfectly. They know that time is working in their favor in certain respects. Every year that passes, the unipolar moment of American dominance recedes a little further into history. Every year, their defensive capabilities improve. Every year, their regional influence grows. Every year, the global financial system becomes a little less dollar-dependent. They don't need to defeat the United States militarily. They just need to survive, to wait out the current period of maximum pressure, to maintain their independence until the balance of power has shifted enough that accommodation becomes more attractive than confrontation. This is why these drone incidents are so revealing. They're probes, yes, but they're also demonstrations of confidence. Iran is essentially saying to the United States, we're here, we're not going anywhere, and you can't force us out without paying a price you're not willing to pay. It's a high-stakes game of chicken, and so far, neither side has blinked, but neither side has escalated to the point of no return either. We intercept their drones, they fly more drones. We conduct freedom of navigation operations, they conduct military exercises. We sanction their oil exports, they find ways to sell oil anyway. Round and round it goes, a Cold War in miniature playing out in the waters of the Persian Gulf. What's often missing from the discussion is any serious consideration of what American interests actually are in this situation. We're told that we need to contain Iran, that they're the leading state sponsor of terrorism, that they threaten Israel and our Arab allies, that they're developing nuclear weapons, that they're destabilizing the region. But let's examine these claims critically. Iran does support groups that we classify as terrorists: Hezbollah, Hamas, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. But from Iran's perspective, and from the perspective of many people in the region, these are resistance movements fighting against foreign occupation and aggression. The terrorism label is politically convenient, but it obscures more than it reveals about the actual dynamics at play. As for threatening Israel and Arab allies, the reality is more complicated than the simple narrative suggests. Israel has nuclear weapons, the most advanced military in the Middle East, and unconditional American support. The idea that Iran poses an existential threat to Israel is questionable at best. It serves both countries' domestic political purposes to maintain this narrative, but the actual behavior of both nations suggests a more calculated dance than a life-or-death struggle. Similarly, our Arab allies in the Gulf are wealthy, well-armed states that have been buying American weapons for decades. They are perfectly capable of managing their own regional security, and in fact, several of them have been quietly normalizing relations with both Israel and Iran in recent years, recognizing that cooperation might serve their interests better than permanent confrontation. The nuclear question is perhaps the most manipulated issue in the entire discussion. Iran had a nuclear program that was frozen under the JCPOA, the deal that Trump withdrew from in 2018. Since that withdrawal, Iran has increased its uranium enrichment, which was entirely predictable. When you tear up an agreement that was working and impose maximum pressure instead, you remove any incentive for restraint. But here's the thing that never gets mentioned. Iran hasn't actually built a nuclear weapon, despite having the technical capability to do so for years. If they wanted a bomb, they could have one. The fact that they don't suggests that their nuclear program is more about leverage and prestige than about actually acquiring weapons. It's a bargaining chip, a hedge against regime change, a symbol of technological achievement and national pride. And destabilizing the region? Let's be honest about who has actually destabilized the Middle East over the past few decades. The American invasion of Iraq destroyed the regional balance of power and created a power vacuum that Iran has filled. The intervention in Libya turned a functioning state into a failed state plagued by civil war and slave markets. The support for regime change in Syria prolonged a conflict that might have ended years earlier with far less suffering. The unconditional support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen has enabled what the United Nations has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. When we talk about regional destabilization, we might want to look in the mirror before pointing fingers at Iran. None of this is to say that Iran is blameless or that its government is admirable. The Islamic Republic is an authoritarian theocracy that suppresses dissent, discriminates against women and minorities, and uses brutal methods to maintain power. But foreign policy isn't about finding the most virtuous partners. It's about identifying your actual interests and pursuing them effectively. And the question we should be asking is whether the current policy of confrontation with Iran actually serves American interests, or whether it's a legacy of old thinking that no longer applies to the world we actually live in. Consider the alternatives for a moment. What if, instead of treating Iran as an implacable enemy, we acknowledge them as a significant regional power with legitimate security interests? What if we recognized that a stable, non-hostile Iran could actually contribute to regional security instead of threatening it? What if we explored whether a grand bargain involving sanctions relief, security guarantees, regional cooperation on issues like terrorism and drug trafficking, and normalization of diplomatic and economic relations might serve our interests better than permanent confrontation? These aren't radical ideas. This is the kind of pragmatic diplomacy that the United States used to be known for, the kind that produced the opening to China in the 1970s, that ended the Cold War without a shot being fired, that has managed far more dangerous adversaries than Iran. But that kind of diplomacy requires us to let go of the idea that the world must conform to American preferences, that countries who resist our dictates must be punished into submission, that the unipolar moment can be extended indefinitely through the application of military and economic pressure. It requires accepting that we live in a multipolar world now, where other powers have agency and interests that we can't simply override. It requires recognizing that the Middle East doesn't exist to serve American strategic goals, that the people who live there have their own aspirations and grievances, and that our attempts to dominate the region have often backfired spectacularly. So, when you see news about an F-35 intercepting an Iranian drone near American warships, understand that you're looking at a small piece of a much larger puzzle. You're seeing the continuation of a conflict that has roots going back to 1979, that involves fundamental questions about global power and economic systems, that reflects the tension between a declining hegemon trying to maintain its position and rising powers seeking to reshape the international order. You're watching a geopolitical drama where the stakes are enormous, where miscalculation could lead to catastrophic war, and where the outcome will shape the world your children and grandchildren inherit. The real question isn't whether Iran is a threat. The real question is whether American policy is making us safer, or just perpetuating a cycle of confrontation that serves the interests of defense contractors and foreign policy ideologues more than it serves the interests of the American people. The real question is whether we have the wisdom to adapt our strategy to change circumstances, or whether we'll cling to old paradigms until they drag us into conflicts we can't afford and don't serve our interest. The real question is whether we can move beyond the simple narratives of good versus evil, friend versus enemy, dominance versus defeat, and embrace the kind of complex, pragmatic diplomacy that the 21st century demands. These are the questions we should be asking as we watch these encounters unfold in the Persian Gulf, because the answers will determine not just the future of American-Iranian relations, but the future of American power in a rapidly changing world.